So I'm glad to be here. Open source is a topic that I've got a passion and interest in. When I was at BlackBerry, I was there for 5 years, and part of my role there was in corporate development to acquire and evaluate startups. And one of the common themes, as you can imagine, for a tech company like BlackBerry is a lot of companies we buy use open source software, and so it was just a common theme. And so there was a lot of risks that we learned along the way, and so I wanted to share with some of those with you guys today. But before we get into the presentation, I just want to get a sense of the audience here. Who's actually never heard of open source software? Okay. And who is a software developer, whether in this life or past life? Because we've got a couple. Yeah, that's fantastic. And who works with open source software, whether as a tool or as, okay, fantastic. So with open source software, let's start with why it matters. Almost every company uses open source software today, especially tech companies. But the problem with open source software is that most companies actually don't know what open source software they use. And unfortunately, they just don't find out until an acquisition situation or some sort of scenario where someone's doing diligence on the company. And then all of a sudden they realize, hey, you know, use of open source software, while it's free, it doesn't come without its risks. And principally for a lot of the clients that we work with in the emerging space, your source code, like that's your treasure, like that's your secret sauce, that's your gold. You got to protect that. And some of these unintended consequences with use of open source software will potentially require you to disclose and give away the very thing you've been working on. That is principally by far the common risk that our clients face. There's other risk as well that there's kind of that comes along with it. You could be required to give away patent rights if you own patent, or you could lose the rights to use your open source software. And in many cases, a lot of times when our clients build software, it's not from scratch. And that open source piece is actually a critical piece of their entire solution working. And so when you have this critical piece that you no longer have the rights to use, it could be expensive to remediate. But I really think there's an opportunity for really savvy companies to really get ahead of some of these challenges. And so there's really three things that I'd really like to kind of talk about. And I just encourage, if you have questions, let's keep it dynamic, interactive. Let's ask. And I've got questions for you guys as well. Really four things. Go ahead. Is there a question at the back? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about open source software, some of the risks, but not just in the abstract. Let's frame it. Let's frame it from the example of your company that's going to get acquired. Let's talk about risks in that, in a scenario setting. And then let's talk about some practical things that we can take away. And then we'll show you a tool that we've developed that can help mitigate some of these risks. So open source software, in one sentence, open source software is software where the source code, the recipe, is made available under an open source license. License is just a fancy word for the right to use something. So the way I think about open source software, it's kind of like you go to a restaurant, not only do you get the meal, you also get the recipe with it. And the recipe allows you to recreate it, you can modify it, you can adapt it, and that, in a nutshell, is open source software.
Is there not an implicit definition to include object libraries as well, not just source code?
Yes, and so some people call it open licenses, and so you take out the source. It means it might not always be code. Sometimes these licenses apply to even bodies of text. It could apply to design documents. That's a very valid question. It could apply to object code as well. Yeah. But we'll touch on that in a little bit, but that's a very good point. Examples, Firefox, Mozilla. So, like, where do you get open source? You get open, is that a question? Okay, yeah.
Wouldn't that also depend if you have a commercial open source license?
So that's right. So I don't distinguish between commercial and non-commercial at this point. Open source is just any license where source code is made available. So you can. Microsoft has what you would refer to as commercial open source licenses. Microsoft authored it. And in it itself, it's Microsoft's way of giving away source code that has very similar, it operates in very similar ways that we'll talk about. But that's a valid point. like where do you get open source? The most common way is people Google. They go Google online on the internet and they find open source, and it's often free. And the way that we look at open source, and it really helps us understand why open source is drafted the way it is to understand why someone would make it free. And so open source is really about a movement. It's really about the idea that software should be free, not in the sense that you and I think about free. It's not that it doesn't cost us anything, but it's free in the sense that it's free from restrictions. That's the ethos of the open source movement. It's the fact that without restrictions, I can study the source code, I can modify it, I can do what I want with it. That's what we mean by free. And in order for open source to be free, in order to do those very things with it, often it's the case that you need the source code. You need to design, you need to be able to see how it works so you can tweak it. And so that's in a nutshell. And that concept of free is going to permeate through why licenses are drafted the way it is and why it causes some of the risks that it does. And so that guy there is the open source hero. His name's Richard Stallman. He's not exactly a looker, but he authored a lot of these open source licenses that we use. And he's also the leader of the free software movement. Okay. So I want to give you a sense of what these open source licenses look like. They really range the gamut. Many of the open source licenses are not written by lawyers, but really by software developers. And so there's some interesting ones. There's the beerware license, for example. You want to use software in the beerware license. If you see the guy at a bar, just buy him a beer. And then you have the right to use the software. There are the really wacky ones out there too, like the death and repudiation license. You want to use software licensed under this license, you have to be dead. So here's a general question. How would you go about using this license? Just general question. Any thoughts? So you want to use the software, the author says you got to be dead to use it. You take a guess. Anthony, what's that? It's pretty good. Eh? And so basically, this license says you can't use it, but you could submit your use cases to your kids, and they can use it on your behalf. And so that's exactly it. And so you've got all these wacky ones, and that's really far to left field. But really, the common cases are really two types of licenses, and they really play off this concept of free. Many software developers believe that the best way to make software free from restrictions, not in terms of cost, is actually just to draft the license so it doesn't impose a whole lot of restrictions on you. And so we call these permissive licenses. You do whatever you want. You could sell it even though you've obtained it for free. You can modify it. And oftentimes these permissive licenses, they just require you to attribute the author. The author wrote it, so give him credit where credit is due. Everything else is fair game. But not all software developers share this view. The other view of a lot of software developers in the free software movement is that the best way to keep software free is actually to include a vital element to it. And what that means is the software itself is free, but not only that, if you're going to use that free software in some way and combine it with your own software, your own source code must also become free. And so if there's anything to take away from this session, from this portion, it's the understanding of the concept of viral copyleft licenses. Just two characteristics. If you distribute, you got to give away the source code. If you combine it with your own stuff and you distribute your own stuff, you got to give away the source code. Just want to stop right there if there's any questions.
What does the based on mean in the other text?
Oh, it's a fantastic question. So some of these licenses are drafted without reference to copyright law. And that's actually the challenge in interpreting open source licenses. And so based on is not actually a copyright language. And so when we interpret it based on, it depends. There's different schools of thought, from the most conservative to the most liberal. The most conservative school of thought is you can't take any concepts from the copyleft code. So you could look at the code You don't even have to take the code and put in your own. You don't even have to combine it with your own. But even looking at it and taking substantial portions would trigger the based on. That's the most conservative approach. On the other side of the spectrum is, you'll hear about these concepts if you Google online about, it depends on how you combine. Are you linking it dynamically or statically? In other words, are you combining it at runtime when you're running the software, or are you doing it at compile time when you're building it? That's the other school of thought. And depending on the use case, our view depends on the risk to the client. Sometimes you really want to take a very conservative approach to remove all risk.
So how about if you don't link it, you're safe against GPL? Is that fair?
The problem is it doesn't cover cases where you're copying code. And so when we were at BlackBerry, I used to be a software developer, and a lot of the stacks, a lot of software developers copy it left, right, and center. So a lot of the TCP IP stacks, it sounds like you're a developer as well. It's really hard to make it compatible. You can read a standard, and then you can try to implement a standard. But implementing a standard is completely different than all the nuances that are drafted in the standard. So a lot of software developers, when we were writing the stack at BlackBerry, the TCP IP stack, they just took the open source one, and then they just put it there. So taking source code is clearly based on. And then you step one step further, and you look at how it's designed. You can change all the variable names, all the functions. If it still looks like from someone who knows how to code, it's basically ripping their code with all the names changed, the design's still the same. There's still an argument that that's based on. We've got a few more thoughts, but if we could talk about how I typically advise clients, depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve, that we can kind of just mitigate the risk. But those are fantastic questions. Keep them coming. The good news is when you're dealing with open source software, there are hundreds and hundreds of them. But really, when you break it down, the top 10, 15 are either permissive that we talked about. You could basically do what you want. Just tell the world that if the author wrote it, he wrote it, but you can charge for it. You can do everything else you want. And those are in green. The other are the copyleft viral licenses that have some sort of source code disclosure requirement. You got to give away your source code if you combine and use it in a certain way. And those are in red. And then the in-betweens are kind of not highlighted. And so they range the spectrum. But I think the most useful way to talk about the risks is not in the abstract, but really in a live scenario. A lot of the attendees here either have companies or work with companies that when they try to sell or invest, someone's going to look into how you use open source. So if we frame it in that way, it's a bit more practical and it might help. So let's use, for example, you're a tech company. Almost every tech company that I work with, their solution is based on one of the three, if not all three. They either distribute software, they've got a web platform, or they've got some sort of mobile application. I bought a guitar effects pedal this weekend. It had all three. There was a web app, there was a mobile app to control my guitar effects. It's distributed software that I installed in my PC. Let's just assume you use a few of these licenses. And so there's an opportunity now. Someone's approached you to acquire your company. What are they concerned with? Typically these 4 items, and these are the same 4 items that when I was at BlackBerry, these are the 4 things we looked for. And it's consistently been the case when I look at startup companies. The questions that a strategic acquirer would ask is, are you in compliance with open source licenses? If not, you will lose your rights to use the vast majority of these licenses. Someone stepping into your shoes would have to address that in some way. It could be expensive to remediate. There's always the risk of monetary damages. I downplay that risk a little bit because the enforcement bodies tend to be volunteers. So there's still that risk there. There's also the reputational risk if you're engaging with the open source community. Okay. The second question that always gets asked is the company I'm buying as the acquirer, are they required to give away the source code? If they are, gosh, like that is a lot of the value of what I'm buying. If they have to give that away, will my competitors get access to it? And it dilutes the value of what they're buying. Third question they ask, a lot of times strategic acquirers buy technology companies because they plan to integrate in some way. They plan to build on top of it as part of the portfolio. And if they do that, if I'm BlackBerry, for example, and I buy a company, am I going to infect my own BlackBerry source code such that I have to give away my BlackBerry source code? All the questions that cross our mind. And of course, the last is, how are the practices like of the target company we're buying? Do they have robust open source practices? And so I'm going to go through just 3 or 4 steps in what it looks like when we used to buy companies and when we bought, when we looked at it from an open source perspective. Acquirers will often just ask outright what open source licenses you use. And they will focus on the copyleft licenses because, as we discussed, permissive licenses let you do almost anything you want. It's the copyleft ones that tend to trigger concerns. The general rule is that the vast majority of the undesirable effects of open source licenses are triggered on distribution. And so a strategic acquirer will look at distributed software first. If there's no distribution, generally you don't have to give away source code and all of the other undesirable effects go away. Okay, so if you're using open source on the back end, you're using it as like OpenOffice, for example, low risk. You're just using Firefox browser, low risk. High risk is when you start taking open source software, combining with your own, and now you're shipping it. That's active distribution will require you to also give away the source code to the recipient. Okay?
If
Yeah.
your model is sort of SaaS-like, so a customer uses your software in the cloud, does that constitute distribution? Because it's not on the customer side.
That's a fantastic question. The other thing that acquirers will do is look at your cloud solution.
Okay.
And so, in short, the general rule is you have to be careful about copyleft licenses in web pages in JavaScript. And you need to be careful about licenses specifically targeted at the cloud. And so more directly to your question, if I had used GPL code in JavaScript, that act of a user accessing a web page downloads that web page on their computer first. That's a distribution. So you have to be careful about these corner cases. But I hear that all the time. We're a SaaS solution, and so it doesn't matter that we use GPL. Well, it depends on where you use it. The second scenario you need to be careful about is some licenses are drafted specifically to cover that. And so the guy with the beard that I showed like slides and slides ago, when he drafted some of these original licenses, he wanted to capture the viral effect. And what he noticed was that people were circumventing that by using a cloud solution and saying that I'm using a cloud solution and therefore there's no distribution. So he went ahead and worked on this new license called the Ephemeral GPL, the AGPL. And that license says, you know what? If you are making available your software over the internet, that counts as a distribution. You have to give away source code. So those are the 2 scenarios that we typically look for. It sounds like you've actually worked with open source and encountered a lot of these questions. So here's another corner case. We'll look at mobile software. Yes, it is distributed, but in addition to the distribution problem, some licenses are actually not compatible with application stores. And specifically, the classic example that we see again and again is licenses that are drafted for libraries. A library is really modules, open source modules that you can kind of plug in and out. They're not actually compatible with application stores because a lot of these licenses require the flexibility of the person receiving the application to take apart the open source piece, modify it, that's the freedom aspect, and put it back together. The problem with app stores is a lot of them are signed binaries. You can't change it. And Apple does that, for example, to really protect the user so that nobody can change a mobile app and inject spyware or any kind of malicious code into application that you download. That very same security mechanism makes it impossible for you to comply with some of these open source licenses. Okay. We'll go through this again when I summarize because I know some of this is starting to get a little bit technical for the non-technical audience. But the last step is really not a technical point. It's that acquirer will ask, am I acquiring a company that has a lot of patents? If I am, some of these licenses actually require you to give away patent rights. Other licenses will say you can't sue because if you sue, you're going to lose the rights to use this critical piece of software. And so these are limits that are of interest to inquire. And then, of course, there's security, the Heartbleed problem you might have seen or heard about in the news. That was an open source tool. That open source component, people knew about that flaw months and months ago. It's just that people didn't know they had or were using OpenSSL. Most companies don't know what open source software they use. So they couldn't take steps to mitigate or address or implement some of the bugs. And of course, open source practices. Okay. So I'll summarize all this again because I know we went a little bit quickly. But in terms of practical pointers, like practical takeaways on how to really manage use of open source software, it really starts with just taking stock of what we use and have, and to just categorize them. Not all open source software use cases present the same risk. Back-end software like Office tools, low risk. Firefox, low risk. Then you have products that are not distributed to customers. Like the gentleman mentioned, the cloud software. As long as it doesn't have those exceptions, generally it's low risk. Yes?
Do you see more issues in vertical software versus horizontal software companies or not in terms of, people digging into the code and saying that's a problem, or is it more applicable to one or not in your experience?
I actually don't. To me, the risk exposure is actually how likely it is that someone knows you're using open source, rather than that dichotomy. How likely it is that, so if you have end user software and you're a participant in the open source community, that tends to be the dichotomy that creates the risk or not. If you're creating enterprise software, it's unlikely that someone's going to figure something out. If you're using consumer software, it's more likely that your exposure is greater, but not in those terms.
I used to work with vertical software companies, and I think the impact is the same. But one thing we used to look at is whether the open source was integral to the software or if it was based on something that was in a module.
That's okay.
So that's the observation, but I don't know if that's it's more of a customer service and sales.
Yeah. Yeah, the plus is if it's not integral, it's easy to replace, it's easy to swap out. The con is, of course, if you're using a non-integral piece, there's the possibility of it infecting the piece that is integral. So that's the area you want to kind of watch it for. And so there's a lot of layers to open source analysis. I think where it starts is just being very cautious about the copyleft licenses. I think there's a place for copyleft licenses, but if you're developing proprietary software, managed use is really important. And so I know we've talked about this principle a few times. If there's no distribution, it's unlikely you're going to be required to give away source code. It's also unlikely that you're going to trigger really any obligations at all. In fact, if you're using copyleft software on the back end, you could do what you want with it. Never have to do anything more. But if there's a distribution, then you're going to want to ensure that if there is copyleft licenses, that it's sufficiently isolated from your own proprietary code. And that's the challenge. Is there a question? Okay. And again, the scenarios to look out for, the cloud scenario is one that's often overlooked. It's the one where most people think there's no distribution, but there actually is. If any aspects of the code it's often JavaScript. That's on the browser side. And if you use the Pharaoh license, the AGPL, access over the internet counts as distribution. And then just watch out for the mobile apps. The LGPL isn't compatible with many of the app stores. Yeah.
You mentioned enforcement earlier. So some of these even moderate ones, it is easy to violate. If you forget to include the copyright statement in the attributions page.
Yep.
Right? So what's the enforcement of that? So you forgot to give the attribution, what happens then?
So often cases for enforcement, funny, most of the lawsuits are, sometimes it's from some of these enforcement bodies, like the Free Software Foundation, they've got a bunch of affiliated bodies. But some of these lawsuits are actually from your own clients. And so some of the more popular ones are clients where there's a dispute and the client says, I actually don't owe you any money because actually what you've given me, you've actually infected all of your stuff with GPL. You should have given it to me the source code anyways, and so I actually don't owe you anything. And so some of the litigation in the States, the recent litigation has been around that concept. It's your own clients that are bringing it back to your attention. The risk of the individual author coming after you is actually low because there's a barrier to entry in terms of the funds to be able to come after you. And then there's also the question of, by the time it got to you, which part did he actually author? And so those are all questions that they'll have to establish, and it's actually not that easy to do. And so for that reason, we say that is a risk, but I typically minimize that as a practical risk. One thing I will say, open source policy, very few companies, when I do diligence on open source, actually have a policy. And having an open source policy will already put you in the minority. When someone asks, hey, do you share with me your open source practices? If you can already produce an inventory of what you use and have some sort of policy to say, here, this is how I comply with licenses. This is how I evaluate open source components before I use them. This is how I participate with the open source community. Just even having that puts you so far ahead of the companies that don't. Of course, having it means complying with it. And then just having training and regularly auditing your software. So that really brings me to the end of the speaking portion anyways. But we've got a tool we want to show you. It's a tool we've been working on that we're excited to launch later, I think in a couple of months. Some of the project team is at the back that are working on the tool, and they can comment on timing. But I'll show you an example of the tool and what it's really designed to do. So the problem is that most companies just don't know what open source they use. And unless you know, that really is baseline, the starting point. You can't even begin to address the risks. The other problem is you go to pay for a very professional audit firm. It becomes very expensive. And so as a consequence, a lot of companies never do a scan. And so we've developed a tool that it's not a replacement for a professional scan of your source code. But what it does is it looks for the top 20 licenses. And so this is how it looks like. Let's say, for example, you've got, this is just our website. It's going to be available on the web. And let's just say, for example, you've got source code. You're just not sure what licenses that you use there. And so you're not alive to kind of the risks. And so you would just choose a folder and you would click scan. What our tool does, it does a regular expression search. And so you spoke of binaries earlier. It will not scan binaries. It will only search source code. And it's going to break down to you, for you, the various licenses that are found in your source code. And so you'll see I scanned TreeFrog, which is basically like a framework for the Swift language. And so it shows right away, look, you've got some of these copyleft licenses, the very ones where distribution would actually cause you an issue. Before, you might not have known that, but at least the tool twigs your mind to that. And then you can kind of take a look at what these files are that are subject to that risk, and at least now start to take steps to do something about it. So it breaks down a pie chart form, all the various licenses that you're using. It's not perfect, but it's better than not doing anything at all.
Which language is this for?
So this is not, so this is actually not language-based because it's regular expressions. It actually looks for a list of, in the FAQs, it has a list of common source code extensions. So we'll do like .c's, .cpps, .h, .js, all the common extensions. But it's not even actually, if we've missed one of the source code extensions, let us know, we'll add it. Yeah.
How do you type that functionality? Sure, you use that a critical piece of the menu, so to speak, or is it just kind of, it's kind of identifying it as a really big risk?
Okay, so this tool will not tell you that. The way I identify is actually to go back on the analysis. I always ask when I do an open source analysis, do you have an architectural diagram? Without that, it's really hard to tell whether it's actually important or not, whether the right measure is actually just to swap it out or not, whether there's a distribution or not, whether there's a combination that causes a risk. And so you can't tell from this. It's often an architectural diagram and a question with one of the members of the technical team. That's how I determine.
You can't figure out yet how these two
Like in the sense that what would cause the major risk?
Yeah.
Okay. And so more specifically, I would actually start with this tool. So in your example, I would run this tool against your source code repository. I would actually look to see if any of the copyleft licenses come up. And if they do, I would actually just see if any of these pieces are exactly a part of the critical. If GPL and LGPL didn't show up at all, I actually wouldn't even be concerned. I actually wouldn't be very concerned with any risks at all. If they are concerned, then I would ask if it ties back to some of the critical pieces you're looking at. That would be the link. And then depending on what it is, address it in the appropriate way. Yeah.
by addressing it, you need to replace that open source one.
Yeah, so a lot of times you can probably replace it with another equivalent that may have different but perhaps comparable features that's also open source, but under a license that doesn't cause you as much concern. And then failing that, you could also re-architect your solution so that there is no combination. That's the other way to do that. And the other way would be, like, technically, you would really separate the two and make the two components talk to each other through an inter-process communication or through sockets or some other way. So you either find a replacement or you re-architect the solution so that there's not a combination. There's not a technical combination. And so then it's the question of how crucial that part is and how it's architected with all the components around it. Yeah.
Your comment about the App Store is interesting because you pointed out that if it's a signed image, then you can't actually reuse the source code, violating the principle of free software. So if you have then an on-prem installation, so it's clearly distributed, and you're only providing binaries, but you have a lot of open source software that went into the creation of those binaries, are you actually in violation then because you can't actually share the source code?
So let's be specific. Are we talking about the LGPL?
Well, no, I mean, I'm
Okay.
talking generally because this is about being able to share the software, right? Is the software free? So if you're only providing binaries, you're not actually making it shareable.
Yeah. So there's two scenarios there. Either it depends on which license because they're all different. In the case where it's the GPL, and the GPL is the first of the two.
Right.
If you're giving binaries to someone, is that the first scenario? You're giving binaries?
Yeah.
So basically, you would also give them the complete open source as
So
well.
you would have to. but if
You would have to.
Okay.
That's right. And you could do that in a few ways. You can give it to them on the same CD. You can make it available for download where they got the binary. You can do it any number of ways. In the LGPL scenario, it's a different license. That license requires you to be able to put things back together again. In that case, you could also do that because you could give away your proprietary stuff, and then you could also give away the LGPL. The problem with the App Store is you can't do that through the App Store mechanism because it's signed.
Right.
And you have no way of really giving things to the end user through that means. And so one of the defensive measures you could take is in the App Store disclaimer, you can outright say, look, this is a limitation, but if you want to be able to exercise your rights to be able to put things together and back together again, here's a link to where I store everything. Go do it there. And while it doesn't comply technically with the license, it at least gives you a defensive measure where, look, the spirit of the license has been met. And so what are the damages really? And so that's another way you can kind of address the LGPL. But yeah.
Are people using just in terms of the contract with the customer? You never really kind of certain problem with the software, where you say that actually you're paying for service. So again, back to kind of the vertical software thing. So you're, the calls to the customer support, that, in some ways, they're not it's not really that you're not really buying software, quote unquote, but you're buying, our team's time to service the software, our, standing by for all your help needs and I have a question.
Yeah, so it's two comments on that. The first is it's always a question of what you are actually doing versus what you're calling it. The other comment is you just have to be careful the way you draft some of these commercial licenses that layer on top of especially GPL. Because one of the requirements of some of these copyleft licenses is that you cannot impose any further restrictions. And the interpretation is actually very strict. So once you start imposing things and layering things on top of it, it could be interpreted as an additional restriction and you'd lose the rights to use it. So you just have to be cautious the way we do that. But it's often it's a substance over form. Yeah. Anthony?
Will be able to link this to a code repository like GitHub so you can have on your.
So that's a great question. Not in the first version. The first version you had to, so I was just at the Tree Frog GitHub. I had to actually download the repository. So I just downloaded locally. But that'd be a fantastic feature set. And the product team is actually at the back. And so, and I think Heather's managing that. So, but that's a wonderful feature for sure.
A lot of your tech is developed by external contractors or dev shops. Are there any best practices or things you should watch out for in these contracts?
Yeah, so from a contracting perspective, I always actually ask them to disclose what open source they're using and obtain your permission before they use it, because they could put you in a very difficult position otherwise. So one of the clauses that I include in contractor agreements is when they include not just open source, but really any third party of which open source is an example. Let us know. And then you should have approval rights so you know exactly what you're signing up to. Yeah. And then you could, of course, use this tool to validate whether they've complied with that. But fantastic questions. You could throw all the hard ones out. I think almost every question that you might have thought of, we probably would have encountered in some way. So happy to speak here or happy to speak one-on-one. So thank you for the, thank you for the opportunity to speak of open source. It definitely is a passion of ours here. And if you have questions, let us know. And then I'm not sure, Heather, if you have any comments about the product or anything you want to talk about in terms of release. Heather's the product manager and a project manager for the open source tool.
Yeah, we're hoping to, thank you. We're currently refining the tool, so it's in beta, and we're hoping to release it in early May.
Great. So you look for it on our website. I'm sure we'll make a splash.
We will.
Perfect. So if there aren't any other questions, Sam mentioned he's going to stick around. So if you want to chat with him, feel free after this session. On your tables, there should be a feedback form. So if you can please do us a favor, take 2 minutes to fill that out. It'll help us with planning for our future sessions. And if you have specific topics that are important to you or that you think would be interesting for this group, please feel free to share those with us. Our next session is going to be April 16th. We're going to be talking about workplace harassment, so a very different topic, but something that's relevant, especially these days with things like the Me Too movement. So stay tuned for an invite for that one, and then we'll also be sharing the slides from this session. So if you didn't catch all the content or you want to take a look at those, we'll be distributing those to the guest list. Other than that, thanks again for attending, and stay tuned for the next session. Thanks again.